Hello, I'm Graham Horton and welcome to today's video. Now in this video I'm going to demonstrate the differences between constant aperture lenses and variable aperture lenses. Now constant aperture lenses are found in the Panasonic Lumix bridge camera range like the FZ200 and the 300-330, and the variable aperture lenses are found in the FZ80, the FZ1000, 2000, 2500, etc. So first of all, what's the difference between a constant aperture and a variable aperture lens? Well, with a constant aperture lens, throughout the zoom range, the aperture will stay at a fixed value. So if I set this FZ330 to f2.8, as I zoom all the way from the 25mm to 600mm effective focal length, it will stay at f2.8. In the case of a variable aperture lens like this FZ80, if I set f2.8 at the widest angle setting of 20mm, when I zoom towards the 1200mm effective focal length, we'll find that aperture is now f5.9, so it hasn't stayed constant throughout its zoom range, and that's why it's called a variable aperture lens. Now there is a difference in construct between the two lenses, which makes the constant aperture lenses a premium price compared to the variable aperture lens. And in fact, if you were trying to find a constant aperture lens for something like a mirrorless camera, you'd be paying something like 3 or 4 times the cost of the same focal length lens in a variable aperture form. So how do you discover if you've got a variable aperture or a constant aperture lens? To demonstrate that, I'm going to look at these two cameras, the FZ330 and the FZ80, and I'll show you the differences and what you can expect in your photography if you're going to be using either of these cameras. Let me demonstrate now on these cameras how you can discover whether you've got a constant aperture or a variable aperture lens and some of the features of the lens itself. Let me switch over to the desktop camera, and here on this FZ330 you can see the wording around the lens, and in particular I want to look at this value here, which is 1 to 2.8. It's only 2.8, there's no other number on here, so this means this is a constant aperture lens, and it will stay at its widest aperture of f2.8 if you zoom all the way from 4.5 to 108mm focal length. Now you notice here I'm using the native focal length of the lens, which is 4.5 to 108mm. To get to the equivalent full frame equivalent focal length, you multiply these native focal lengths by the crop factor of the sensor, and in the case of a 1/2/3 inch sensor we're talking of 5.7 times crop. So if you multiply 5.7 by the native aperture, you'll end up with the 25 to 600mm that this lens is quoted to have. So that is the FZ330. If we look at the FZ80, and again let's go back to the desktop camera, you can see now on the lens decal we've got 1 to 2.8, but then there's a dash to 5.9, which means that this lens will change its aperture from f2.8 to f5.9 over its range of 3.58 to 215mm. Again, those values there of 3.58 to 215 are the native focal lengths. Multiply again by the crop factor of 5.7 and you arrive at the 20 to 1200mm that this lens is famed for. So there you can see how you can tell if you've got a constant aperture lens or a variable aperture lens. I'll now show you how this works out in practice if you look at the aperture on the back of the camera as you zoom through the range, and then I'll go through some of the scenarios where you might want to overcome those limitations if you're shooting outdoors or even indoors for some photo shoots. Let's now look in practical terms how that works with your camera. Let's look at the FZ300-330 first of all, and here on the back of the camera you can see my aperture at the moment is f2.8 and I'm at the widest angle setting of 25mm. So you can see here on the LCD screen we got f2.8. Let's re-engage the exposure meter. Now as I move from the 25mm position, if I go to 28mm you can see it's stayed at 2.8, go to 35mm, still at 2.8, 50mm, 2.8, and you notice that as I aim through the whole range the camera is now still staying at f2.8. so this is the effect of a constant aperture lens. Now that doesn't preclude you from setting the lens to any aperture you want. So if I wanted the sweet spot of this particular lens, which is around f4, then as I zoom again through the whole range you notice it stays at f4. Let's look in contrast now to the FZ8082. Again, we'll turn this camera on and have a look on the back of the camera. And again, I'll set this down to f2.8. So you can see on the LCD display we've got f2.8, and I'll do the same test. If I go to 28mm, you can see the aperture has now gone to f3.2. Go to 35, it's gone to f3.9, and if I go to 50mm, you can see it's gone to f4.7. And now as I zoom towards the 1200mm position, you can see eventually we end up with an aperture of f5.9. You can see it on screen. So as I zoom back down to 20mm, you'll see we've gone back to 2.8. So that's the effect of a variable aperture lens. And as with the FZ330, it doesn't preclude you from setting in an f4 aperture. So if I set in f4, you'll notice that it stays at f4 all the way up to about 50mm, which is a crossover point of this lens for the variable aperture. So at 50mm we're at f4.3, and then it will gradually move back to f5.9 as we approach the 1200mm position. So you've seen now how the focal length affects the aperture with the variable aperture lens, which means that you're losing 2 stops of light going from the wide angle to the telephoto position. And that's important if you're going to be shooting something like birds in trees, birds in flight, that sort of thing. You've lost 2 stops of light, which means you've got to overcome that in terms of the exposure, either by increasing your shutter speed, so you're going to have a longer shutter speed, or you're going to increase the ISO, which means you're going to run into noise. So there are some consequences of changing the exposure by either using a longer shutter speed or a higher ISO. There are some tips I can give you to overcome that. Obviously you want to try and keep the ISO as low as possible, ideally around about the 80 or 100 ISO. To do that you need additional lighting. If you're in a studio you could add extra lights, or you could use flash. If you're outdoors, there are some flash extenders which allows you to put a Fresnel lens on your flash to extend that flash light over a greater distance. So you can see with these variable aperture lenses, when you approach the full telephoto position, you are going to be using that smaller f-stop. To overcome that, you need to be using longer shutter speeds and run the risk of getting handshake or subject motion blur. With these variable aperture lenses, if you're shooting something like birds in trees, you need to be using something like a 500th of a second to overcome subject motion blur. You don't want the bird moving its head, otherwise you'll get subject motion blur. So to get 500th of a second at f5.9, you're probably going to be using ISO 800 or above, which means you are going to be running into some noise issues with these smaller sensor cameras. So that's it for my explanation of constant aperture versus variable aperture lenses. Hope you found that useful. Of course, if you're a new viewer, why not hit that subscribe button and the bell notification icon to be advised when I upload new videos to the channel. Also check out my photographic blog if you've not already seen that. I'll put a link to that in the video description below. You'll find lots more information on Panasonic Lumix bridge cameras and on Fuji and Canon mirrorless cameras. And on the home page is an application form to join my newsletter group. That goes out to just under 4,000 people every 4 or 6 weeks, and it's a technical newsletter in its own right. So do check that out if you're not already a subscriber to it. So until the next video, as usual, thanks very much for watching. Please do take care, and I hope to see you all very, very soon. Goodbye for now.